the things that came up at a recent council meeting was an issue one of the residents was having with a neighbor in their neighborhood. And could you tell us a little bit more about what that was?
Oh, sure. I was just going to say, it's one reason I like my job. People ask me what I do. I say I'm never 100% sure because some of these things come up, just seemingly overnight.
Yeah.
This actually was a problem that did not develop overnight, but it was a nuisance issue with stray and feral cats, cats that have never been pets, or are the progeny of former house pets that became strays.
Right. And if I can interrupt just for a second, so we often refer to it as maybe a little more technical, feral cats, but commonly we're talking about cats that are wild in many cases. Some are wild to the extent they've never interacted in a more domesticated environment. So that becomes the issue where we're not necessarily just talking about little fluffy kittens.
Right.
We're
This is not
talking
someone
about wild
escaped
cats.
house pets. These are feral cats in the
Correct,
neighborhood.
correct.
Yeah.
And once they reach adulthood, they're really not suitable for. It doesn't suit them or the family for them to try to live in a house. They won't. They're just not adoptable in that manner.
Yeah.
And that becomes part of the difficulty that we're dealing with, and that's why anytime we start the conversation, I try to emphasize we're not necessarily talking about little fluffy kittens. We're talking about cats that people would consider wild.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and they're predators as well.
So what we had at the meeting was someone who there were feral cats, not escaped house pets, but feral cats in their neighborhood, and they were causing some problems. They weren't just one or two walking through their backyard. They were causing some problems. So what was going on?
Well, they were mainly tearing up landscaping, feces and urine problems around houses. And then the sheer number of them, it's a little strange if you're going on a typical suburban street to turn down the street and then see cats all over the place. It looks a little like
It looked
a
like
horror
an
movie
Alfred
or something.
Hitchcock film
Yes,
with
exactly.
cats
Yeah.
just,
Right.
wow,
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
Instead of the birds, it's cats.
It's the
Exactly.
cats,
Right.
okay.
They chased away the birds.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that's a musical, but yes.
Right, Chris, it's probably fair to say that because we live in essence next to a forest area, it's not unusual that you're going to have wild cats in the environment. So the fact that there were some wild cats was not the unusual aspect of this. I think it was the gathering, the numbers, and the reasons that they were gathering. So that's what we need to talk about.
So they were not just in this neighborhood because they just selected it as their new neighborhood. They were in this neighborhood because someone was luring them there.
Correct.
And I'll say I think a neighbor was feeding them. And even though they're wild animals and not pets, they were kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong. And so that was
it was their
into the
intention to
neighborhood,
feed the wild animals.
Okay.
And that's why normally this kind of thing, you could almost say let nature take its course because it will. Cats are not our biggest problem with nuisance animals. We have more calls about skunks and coyotes, actually.
Wow, okay.
And some of the calls for coyotes are, someone has heard one howl or just wants to know more information, but also specific sightings. And skunks are our number one nuisance animal. But in this case, there was food being put out on a daily basis, and these cats were gathering in ever greater numbers, reproducing, and setting up essentially a colony on a small cul-de-sac that had only 6 houses. And so you can imagine that's a concentration that starts to affect your quality of life. And when we had the initial report from the one neighbor and talked to the neighbor that that had been putting the food out, and there was some fundamental disagreement on whether that was a good idea or not.
Okay.
In the end, we ended up citing that neighbor to court in fining for contributing to the malicious activity of these cats. So we had evidence that they had torn up the shrubbery and that sort of thing. And because that resident was feeding the cats, it gave them some responsibility for that. Because if they hadn't been feeding them, that's the logic. The actual feeding is not currently, it's not against the law. There's nothing in the ordinance that says you may not put food out for cats or other wild animals. Okay. And I'm sure that there are people here and there that do.
Okay.
This was a case, though, of just the numbers got too great. And we had a meeting with, we announced we were going to have a meeting about this, and we had several of the neighbors come in, 5 households altogether, and which is pretty good on this small cul-de-sac. And it was interesting to me because there was a consensus that this was a problem. The resident that was putting the food out didn't even really claim to like cats.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Wanted to make sure that all the wildlife was healthy and happy and well fed. And what I can get back again to, like, you're taking things out of balance. Those cats would not have multiplied without a food source like this. And so the immediate thing, if you're in a hole, and the first thing to do is stop digging.
Stop digging, right.
So was to get her to cease feeding the cats. And it's been it's been some difficulty in getting compliance on that, but it's certainly not in the scale or frequency that we were seeing before. And then we are going to be engaging a wildlife contractor to do some trapping. And we have agreement from all of the residents, including the one that was feeding, to put traps on their property, because everyone does agree that this has gone too far.
Okay.
And they would like to see that population thinned out. And so that's coming very soon. We just opened purchase orders this year, so we're gearing up for that. And then we are looking at some revisions to our ordinances. One is if someone is a repeat offender in this area, that there could be an escalating fine. And we needed to do that in some other areas of code enforcement and animal control. Typically for that one person who just is wants to be difficult.
There's a reason for every rule, right?
Yeah, well, I always say beware a little bit of laws that have names on them.
Yes,
But in any case, nothing too extreme. I mean, these are incremental adjustments to our ordinances, but where we really needed to kind of come down hard in this case, we didn't have every tool that we wanted in the toolbox. I mentioned that it's not really against the law to feed them, so that created some confusion on just, we had a resident saying, show me where it says I can't do this, and we had to explain that, that's not there, but it does make you responsible if they cause problems, and they are causing problems. We have evidence, and but we had that neighborhood meeting, and what I was really surprised and glad to see was the meeting itself was contentious, as you might imagine. You had 2 different points of view, and there was a lot of discussion about that. But I was glad to see everybody left friends. In fact, 2 people that I thought on first glance, must not have liked each other, they made sure to walk out together. So, and many of these are longtime residents, up to 55 years in one case.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so, I think if we can get through this, then, and I think there's probably no lasting harm done. Everyone, is being, I think, mature and responsible in approaching this.
And I think that's key because we know that there was an issue, and the city agreed with the neighbors that that felt it was a problem. It was not what Forest Park wanted in terms of an overpopulation of cats. But at the same time, rather than start out with just coming down as a heavy-handed government, Chris took the lead and called residents in and said, let's talk about it, and let's talk about what the problem is, and let's talk about what the city could do and will do, or at least would plan to do. And together, you know, if we can, we will come to an agreement. If not, we'll at least have a better understanding. And I believe on all points, we edged further in terms of having a better plan, having a better understanding, maybe getting a little more cooperation, and knowing that, yeah, the city is going to do something. And hopefully it will be in a manner that will make the whole neighborhood better, as well as the city as a whole.
I'll say, watching it from the beginning, when it first was brought up at a meeting, watching it get immediately referred to city manager to look into the matter further, I liked what I was seeing with the process from a resident's perspective. A resident had a concern, and instead of being told it's not something we do, they said, let's see what we can do. But then, like you said, it was also, what should government do in this situation? Rather than just coming down and saying, we're going to do this, it was, you looked into great detail into what ordinances do we have and what does this affect. And we don't have an ordinance against feeding, but we do against damage and being responsible for the damage that was.
Right.
And bringing the whole neighborhood in.
Yeah, and one other point that I think is important. We need to address this not only for the residents involved, but we also need to address it for the wildlife. We have to be concerned with the wildlife and the balance of wildlife. And I'm quick to say, you know, this is not a zero tolerance type of approach. This is an approach where we have to have a wholesome balance for the community as well as the wildlife. The wildlife, the forest area is what we are about, and we need to work at preserving it.
It's all happened in the microcosm of a small cul-de-sac neighborhood. But I'm glad that we got to see it also as a microcosm of their town government stepping in and helping them facilitate this without just fixing it for them, but helping them figure out how as a community they can work together on that. So that's good. It has a good ending. The neighbors are still friends.
Right.
That's important.
I don't necessarily find that surprising, actually, because if you think about it, if you're in a large, dense, diverse area, you may notice that there's a problem. You probably don't know where it's coming from or who's causing it, because there's just so many people, so many different people coming and going. But here, this is, as you say, a small cul-de-sac, a microcosm, people that know each other. They're able to, you know, they know what's going on in their area, and so they were able to identify that problem very easily.
Yeah, and one last point I want to offer, because this is all under our segment of the city addressing feral cats and that issue. But for the neighbors, it was really broader than that, because as this resident was setting out food, in their mind, they're doing a good thing, but for other residents, they're attracting skunks, and they're attracting raccoons, and they're attracting all kind of wildlife, and that's not what people were buying into in terms of trying to live in that neighborhood. That's what was being artificially thrown out of balance, not just attracting of cats, but most people don't want skunks, raccoons, and possums, and everything else running amok in their neighborhood.
So this was contributing to more than initially was intended. It was, seemed like a nice thing to put out some treats, but it turned out to be affecting a lot more than that.
Like anything, it can be taken too far.
Right, and I think that's the point, taken too far.
Yeah, that's key. I like that it's an example of when residents are seeing anything they need help with. Is there an ordinance on this? My neighbor is got this many cars and they're covering up the apron, or my neighbor has this going on, that they know that they have a recourse and that you will help them figure out what's going on and work with the neighborhood and not just kind of come down and beyond the cats. Actually, I really want to thank you for coming in to talking about this, because how this is resolved really, I think, impacts more than just one neighborhood, and it's an issue that people may be seeing in their other neighborhoods as well, but also to let them know that they can talk to their city manager, they can talk to their local town officials and find out what's going on and how they can find a resolution for difficulties they're having.